to the third video of Vray Basics from renderschool.com. We're picking up from the video last time, and this time we are going to talk about Vray Lights. Vray has a couple of different light sources. We're going to have a look at them. We are going to skip the IES light for a more advanced video, but to begin with, let me just down this a little bit so it looks better. We have a rectangular light in the scene, so we might as well start with that. You create them by going to create, lights. We got sphere, dome, rectangular, and IES, and we're gonna have a look at these three now. So the rectangular light is basically a light card, or an area light, whatever you like to call it. When created, it's a 1x1 unit, and you can just scale it to whatever size you want. There's one thing to be aware of when scaling these rectangular lights, and that is that the intensity is not normalized. So the bigger the light is, see if I scale it up real big here, it's gonna shoot out more light. So if you double the size, you're gonna, I guess, go down to a quarter of the intensity to get something that has the same intensity as before. So that's pretty important to keep an eye out for. And same way, if I scale it down, just long thin one, see it gets really dark, but nice and soft. So it can be scaled, but also do bear in mind that that means it will get brighter or duller. So just to start from the beginning, you can enable and disable the light, turn it on and off. You can set a color for the light, or you can set a temperature. I definitely like going with the temperature more than the color. It's just a nice way of getting a bit of saturation into your lights, but without trying to choose a light that makes sense in the photographic world. So I definitely, if I have to set a color on my light, which I like doing, I'll set it to temperature and use the temperature to warm it up or cool it down. As such, see how nicely that works out. So next up is our intensity multiplier. Basically, how bright is the light? I can turn that down a little bit here. There's really not a lot to say about that other than controlling the brightness of your light. Units I actually never really use, so I don't really know how to use them. But next up we have our size, which, just like we can scale it, you can also scale it in here. It has the exact same pros and cons as in just scaling it, so either way, whatever you're comfortable with works. So closing this guy down, we have subdivisions that we talked about last time. We can bump this up if we want to clean up the shadows from this particular light. Let's see, it's doing it, but it's also slowing down our render, of course. So for the sake of you guys not waiting way too long, and we're not spending bandwidth on that, I'm just going to keep that low. Light cutoff threshold. Basically, when does Vray stop calculating the light? You want to keep this pretty low. I think I've changed the value of this twice in my life, so don't worry too much about that. Same thing with override motion blur samples. If you need to motion blur your light more or less than whatever you have in your render settings, that's that button. For example, if you have something really bright and you want to make sure it samples smoother because you're going to get that really nice singy motion blur streak, you might want to up it in here. Next up, shadows. You can set a color for the shadow. You always want it on, I guess. You can set a color and a bias for when should it create shadow and when shouldn't it. If you have very fine detail, you might actually want to lower this value, but it is also gonna slow down your render a bit. But if you have like really small displacement maps and stuff like that, it can make sense. Shadow color can be a little bit it can be fun to work with because it does weird stuff, such as coloring your shadows. If you're faking glass or whatever, or if you're making an arbitrary pass where you just need that shadow as a mask, you can go ahead and use that. But in most cases, you'll want to keep it to black and then maybe use some more fill lights if you want to brighten it up or whatever. So really not a lot to change in here. Of course, you can fake having a bit of radiosity in your scene by upping your shadow color slightly. So let's get rid of those. You can use a texture map for your light, which is really cool. And that can be basically, it can be an image or a procedurally generated thing here. So let's just throw a grid in there and see what happens. See, it actually really does change how stuff looks. I think I want to do a bit more to it. Sorry, I just jumped out here. I'll up the text resolution and I will tell you why in a second. You can see up here that it is doing something in the sample. Let's see. Come on. Well, basically, for gobos or even if you're doing like studio lighting, it's really nice to texture map something on there so you don't have this perfect surface shooting out light. See, we're getting some much more interesting shadows from this than we would if we didn't have the texture on. So it's quite simple. And you just pop whatever you want in there. It's basically a 0 to 1 UV map on a rectangular light, so it should be quite simple. I upped the texture resolution just because we have this kind of fine detailed image in here, or yeah, let's call it an image. So I wanted to make sure that it samples that correctly. What happens is that V-Ray will lower the image to this resolution when shooting out light rays. So just keep an eye on that. This too can be an HDR image. So if you have some nice HDR imaging of or images of studio lights, go ahead and pop those in there, and it's really going to change how your image looks. So I can definitely recommend using textures for your lights. And next up, just real quick, ignore light normals. That just means that it's just going to shoot out, basically shoot out in all sorts of directions instead of just shooting directly straight forward. Like if we use the normal, it's very directed light, and if we're not, it's just going to shoot out from the whole plane. I hope that made some sort of sense. But usually you want to ignore them. If you want to get some very directional light, go ahead and uncheck it. No decay is going back to old school lights that just keep on forever. See, if I hit render here, this is going to be uber bright. Because V-Ray lights by default have a fall off, so the further away you get from it, the brighter it's going to be. I didn't mention that to begin with, and it's quite an important thing because that makes your scene lighting a lot more believable. since that is the way things work in real life. So you want that decay. Um, so yeah, if you just want to add some light to all over your scene, you can uncheck that and just lower your intensity. Double-sided means that it will also shoot light out on the other side instead of just in the direction that we have it here. Invisible can be quite handy because it doesn't render the light, just whatever light it's shooting off. So in case you have a light that's placed inside of your scene to create some nice kick effect or whatever, you can just hide it so it doesn't render. Skylight Portal will look into that later, and start with the Radiance map has to do with global illumination, which we're also going to look at later, so don't worry about that too much. What we can do though is check whether or not the light should affect the diffuse, like the surface light value, speculars in your shader. So if you have like non-reflective speculars, you can make sure if you don't want the light to affect it, or if you do want it to, you can kind of turn it on and off. And boom, the same with reflections. These guys will actually show up as a piece of geometry in your reflections, which is usually really good, but sometimes you don't want it, so you can just uncheck it here. And for diffuse and specular, you can even say, well, I only want it to affect a bit of diffuse and a lot more specular, or however you want it. So say you have a dark surface, you want to put a lot of light on it. You want full diffuse contribution, but your speculars get too hot, so you can actually dial that down a bit. I don't have any specs in this scene, so I'm not really going to go into that, but um, it kind of makes sense every once in a while that your speculars get way too hot because you want to light your scene, so you can just dial that down. All this stuff down here is for later videos as well. So basically that's all there's to the reticule light. It's quite simple. So let's just jump on and create a sphere light. Sphere lights are heavily underrated in my eyes. Um, it's kind of like an omni-light, but it's or omnidirectional point light, but it has a size that creates soft shadows. Note that you can't scale these guys. It's just not going to do anything, so you actually need to set the radius here. And it will give you a light bulb. Clean and simple. And if if you get stuff really close to it, it can make sense to have some more of these sphere segments. But in general, just keep it at whatever it's at. It's going to be a nice round sphere for you. Again, we have sampling, shadows. You can't map texture lights or texture maps into a spherical light, which is a bit sad actually, but that's just the way it is. So you can only go ahead and change the colors of it. Some nice sun we got going on here. As such, and again, you can make it invisible, turn off decay, and store it with your radiance map and the usual suspects. So these lights are actually pretty useful, but a lot of people are arguing that they're hard to control and you waste a lot of energy shooting light out in all sorts of directions, kind of like with an omnidirectional light. And last but not least, we will look at the dome light. And we all love the dome light because it gives us that good old ambient occlusion, global illumination kind of look. And it is really cool. This is how it looks as a standard object I've just pulled in. Let me just scale this guy up just a bit. And grab the light. As you might notice, I don't even think, yeah, the button's not here. There's no decay on light domes because they are they're placed an arbitrary distance away from what you're rendering, so you couldn't really work with decay in the same way. So well, basically, you have your intensity, your value is going to be a lot lower than they were on your other lights, because it's just going to continue full speed ahead with the full amount of lighting, however far it is away from itself. And that is worth keeping in mind. Next little checkbox here is dome spherical. That just means that by default it's only the top half of the light dome that we're rendering, which makes sense if we have like a floor plane or whatever. We don't want to shoot light from below it. But if you're doing say an HDR image you're mapping on there, you do want it to go all the way around. So that's a little bit important to remember to check that on. Ray distance, while I'm at it, is not something we're gonna look into now, but it's useful once you get into using photons and stuff like that. And if you want to have blurry reflections, or sorry, depth of field in your reflections reflecting your dome light. Yes, that made sense. But for most cases, it's not something we're going to worry about, so it's not going to be in the basic video. So next up, subdivisions. On dome lights, more than any other lights, it's usually important to up your subdivisions. As you can see, this is exceptionally noisy, which is because it's just one huge light. Same thing if you have a really large rectangular light, you want to up your subdivisions as well. It just cleans it up quite a bit. And shadows, again, same thing. So I'm not gonna bore you with that. Let's add a texture, make it a file. And I should jump to my desktop and find HDRI. I've got some here that are done. And I'm just gonna grab a low res one. As such. And hit render straight away. And that's probably the simplest way of rendering HDRs. I'm using a low res HDR right now, which I definitely prefer for lighting, as it's going to flicker a lot less. And in a later episode, I'll show you how to set up reflections separately. So, because you don't want soft reflections, you just want your light to be somewhat soft. But the quick and easy way is just that load low res HDR. This is an EXR file. I'm just gonna set that so I'm sure that it's a linear image. I think it was. It doesn't really change anything. That was how it's interpreted, so that's all good. But yeah, you can pipe any texture in there, even high dynamic range ones, such as EXR files. And we will, of course, be looking a lot more into that a bit later. Again, text resolution might be a good idea to up that every once in a while, depending on how big your HDR is. We can turn it off so that it doesn't render in the background. And this is actually quite common to set that, because you don't really want to render your HDR in the background. You probably want to comp this guy on top of something. So in most cases, you actually want to turn that off. Very often you also want to turn off affect reflections, because as I mentioned a second ago, you want to make sure your reflections are taken from a high-res image and not from this low-res lighting ingression. So especially on HDRs, that will very often be turned off. Sorry, on dome lights with HDRs on them, I guess. So other than that, there's really not a lot to it. You can, of course, also go ahead and use good old like spotlights, which I really love, just because there's nothing weird to them. They just do what they're supposed to. When using spotlights, I just definitely prefer to use ray trace shadows. Um, give those a couple of rays, and they are going to behave as they would in Mental Ray or any other renderer. So it's nice and simple, and you don't always have to go to V-Ray's own lights. So bear that in mind, because these guys render really quickly. But yes, that was a very quick rundown of how V-Ray lights work. Again, there's not a lot to it. I just wanted to go through everything just so that we're all on the same page. So I am looking forward to seeing you on the next video. In the meanwhile, I urge you to go ahead to renderschool.com and sign up for the newsletter so that I can keep you informed on whenever new stuff is coming out. And that should be pretty often, hopefully. So go over to renderschool.com and sign up.